Hello, everyone, and welcome to BookTrib Live, a Merrill Media production. Today we are with best-selling author and award-winning columnist Jeffrey Selingo. Jeff is the author of College Unbound and MOOC U. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. He has written for the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Slate, as well as act as a special advisor and professor of practice at Arizona State University. Most recently, Jeff released There Is Life After College, what parents and students should know about navigating school to prepare for the jobs of tomorrow. Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. So the job, let's talk There Is Life After College first. Let's jump right into that. Can you explain a little bit about the book and what you talk about in it?
So the book is looks at the experiences that students now need to have before college, during college, and after college in order to launch into the workforce. It used to be that if you had a college degree, you were golden, right?
Right.
It would be easy to get a job because fewer people had them. And now we are seeing, almost 50% of recent college graduates are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. As more and more people get a bachelor's degree, it's becoming less of a signal that you're job ready. And so the book really lays out what are the experiences that a student needs to have before college, during college, and after college in order to successfully launch into the workforce. And really, the bottom line is it's much more about how you go to college than if you even than where you go, and definitely even if you go.
Okay. So, talking a little bit about the job market because it's forever in flux and not always in a good way. For example, I know my own experience when we were graduating a few years ago. My professor flat out said it's going to suck for you guys because it's not fun out there, which of course you don't want to hear from your own professor. But where does it stand right now, and how has it kind of changed over the past few years?
So the market itself is much better now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago for
Right.
recently graduated seniors. So anybody with a bachelor's degree or even an associate's degree, it's much better to be a college graduate than it is to be a high school graduate,
Okay.
for example. The problem, though, the concern that I have is not that if you have a job, it's what kind of job you have.
Okay.
And what we're finding is that more now than ever before, there are more students, and the Federal Reserve counts almost half of recent college graduates, almost 50% of recent college graduates are what they call underemployed, meaning they're working part-time or
Mhm.
working in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree.
Right.
So being no offense to the baristas at Starbucks, but they're that stereotype of somebody who had to take a job, usually because they had some sort of student debt.
Right.
And that's the problem. So it's less of a problem they can't get any job. It's more of a problem of getting the right kind of job.
And is there any troubleshooting that you can think of, or where does that fault lie at some point? I mean, where does it all come from?
So I did a survey for the book, and I outlined the results of the survey. So we surveyed a nationally representative sample of people in their mid-20s. And what we wanted to know is if we reverse engineered their careers or their lives for the last 10 years, what were the things they did or, more important, didn't do that led them to where they are today? And we found that there were a couple of experiences that really matter. For one, debt is a huge deal after college. So the more debt you take on, the less likely you are to immediately launch into a career or a job. And why is that? Because if you have debt hanging over your head when you graduate from college, most likely you're going to make sometimes bad career decisions because you have to pay off that debt or start to pay off that debt, right? So you're not going to move to a new city for a new job because it's too expensive. You are going to filter every job offer you get through the money you're going to get. So you're going to take a job just for the money, not because it's a good career opportunity. So debt is a big issue. So the less debt you can take on, the better off it is for your career. I know that's kind of hard for some people, but again, it's all about degrees of debt. Second, internships. The more internships that somebody has, the more successful they're going to be after college. And then the third piece is what I call the navigation of college. The more you are, it's not that you necessarily need to, you could explore in college, but the more you explore and wander, the more likely you are to wander after college. And what do I mean by that? So you want to pick a major and pick it relatively soon. You don't want to switch your majors more often, or too often, sorry. And you also want to focus on getting those internships and those other experiential learning opportunities outside the class as soon as you can. So it's those three things. It's internships, debt, and what I would call being able to navigate the institution before graduation.
Okay. So what about the kind of school that you go to? Does that at all play a role? Does it matter when looking for jobs? Is that not something that we should think about in that way anymore?
So in some ways, yes. There are a number of employers that will only recruit at certain types of schools. And it largely goes, either they'll recruit at very large schools, very large colleges and universities, mostly big publics, because they could get a lot of students at once, or they'll recruit at elite colleges or selective colleges where they think the better students are. But as I outline in the book, there's a big shift right now happening in hiring. And there's this increasing use of what's called people analytics. And it's this idea that a number of companies, especially bigger companies, are reverse engineering their careers of their most successful employees. So those employees who survive and thrive over the long term. And what they're finding out when they look back at, well, where did those employees come from? They're
Yeah.
finding out that GPA didn't matter, school didn't matter, major didn't matter. There's all these other measures, were they in leadership positions? Were they college athletes? Did they play music? And the big one is, did they intern? So Facebook did this study, and they found out that their most successful employees actually interned at Facebook. So what ended up happening after that study is they kind of doubled down on their internship program, and they put much more focus on that as a result. So in some cases, it matters where you go, but increasingly, and I think this is going to be a big change over the next 10 years, is I think it's going to matter a lot less.
Okay. Very interesting. What would you say is for you, in your opinion, the most important thing to take away from There Is Life After College?
The most important thing is that I think we should think about college as a lifelong pursuit. So it's not this thing you go to 3 months after high school graduation and 4 years later graduate, and hopefully enter into a career.
Right.
I actually lay out in the book arguments that if you're, for example, not ready to go to college immediately after high school, you should take some time, and not off, but take what is increasingly known as a gap year. I'm not a big
Right.
fan of that term, but get work experience. Join one of these increasing number of outfits that help you get academic experience and work experience in that time, because I think you'll go to college and be more mature about it. After college, there's a growing number of these boot camps and other efforts to get real skills for the workforce. So this idea that we go into college at like one time in our life, and it's in this box
Mhm.
that you enter at 18 and you exit at 22. I think we need to kind of rethink what we mean by education after high school, and I try to lay that out.
Okay. So you've written about college before, of course. Was this book different in any way, maybe in how you approached writing it or the research for it?
So I spent, we did a survey for one thing, which I think really helped anchor the book
Okay.
in some good data to back it up. I spent a lot more time with both current students and recent graduates
Hmm.
than in my previous books, to get a sense of what their fears, not only what their fears were, but what they felt really helped them in their own careers. And I spent a lot of time with employers as well, and that's where I see a big mismatch. And I talk a lot about this in the book, where employers want one thing, and students coming out of college don't necessarily have those experiences that employers want. And it's primarily around what are called the soft skills. So employers are really concerned these days that the new college graduates they're hiring don't have what are known as the soft skills. So these are, communication, teamwork, problem solving, skills that are not, specific, knowing how to code or knowing engineering terms and things like that. And what they're worried about is that students are not necessarily learning these in college.
Okay. And what would you say is the best way to maybe combat that? Or what would you say to the employer who is worried about that?
Well, so from a student standpoint, the best way to combat that is to get out of, those skills are largely learned outside of the classroom,
Right.
right? in in co-curricular activities, in clubs, in sports, in internships or group projects or undergraduate research or study abroad. So the idea that you can't go to college and sleepwalk through college like you used to, and you want to be, and you could actually do that, I think, 20 years ago, as long as you showed up from class and you got that degree. As I said earlier, it was kind of golden, right? Now you have to be much more deliberate about the experiences you have in college in order to succeed after college. And so that's my advice to students. On the employer side, um, I think employers sometimes have they've, their expectations of what they're getting. I think are a little bit high. I think they want fully
Right.
formed adults. They want people in their 30s. When they're really hiring people at 22, I think many employers have given up on training. So I think that employers need to kind of reposition their expectations for this not only for this new generation, but for the workforce that they want to create in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got kind of involved in helping parents with college-bound kids and the higher education leaders?
So I started covering colleges and universities almost 20 years ago, a couple of years after I even got out of college myself. And I started working as a reporter at this publication called the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a trade magazine for people who work in higher education, colleges and universities. And through that, I covered basically every topic imaginable, right? So I covered admissions and student aid. I covered leadership issues with presidents and boards. And so I got to see, and I traveled a lot in that job. I got to see higher education from various points of view, mostly from the inside. And then about 4 years ago, after I was editor of the Chronicle for a couple of years, I started to talk much more to parents and students, and I started seeing a disconnect between their worries and their concerns, largely about the cost of higher education, and what I was seeing from the other side, again, covering the inside of higher education for the Chronicle. And so I decided to write this book a couple of years ago called College Unbound about the future of higher education. And I really wanted to turn the lens on higher education from the outside and focus this book for parents and students. So for the last couple of years, I've been focusing much of my writing and reporting on parents and students, on the consumers of higher education.
Okay. So I'm sure that you can't predict the future, of course, but you mentioned on your site we've surpassed the $1 trillion mark in student loans in this country. Do you see that decreasing in any way? Is there anything to help this, or is this just going to continue?
I really do worry about student debt. As I mentioned earlier, I was kind of surprised. I guess I shouldn't be that shocked, but I was probably surprised by how much student debt shapes a graduate's potential outcomes.
Yeah.
So again, as I said earlier, the more debt somebody has, the fewer choices they have after graduation. In the 20s, it's been said the 20s are the dress rehearsal for the rest of your life. So if you don't quite get your 20s right, you're not going to get your 30s, 40s, and 50s right. And so if we are hanging this large amount of debt on students when they leave college and that's limiting their choices, it's something I worry about. But the problem right now is that the cost of higher education keeps going up, and all we're doing is trying to solve it by throwing more money at the problem, with whether it's student loans or scholarships or other types of aid. And this is not really an issue for students and parents, but I think really the issue for politicians and lawmakers, and I wish this were getting more airing on the campaign trail right now, is how do we reduce the cost of college?
Right.
Because if all we do is attack the money spent on it, it's not going to really help students in the long run, and they're going to have to take out more debt, and it's not going to end up helping anybody in the end.
Right. And I also don't see the expectation of getting that money back. And if, like you said, you're already crippling a 20-something-year-old out of college and they can't afford it, then you're not getting your money. It's almost like a vicious cycle. And I don't see how that helps anyone either.
No, it doesn't. And this is why in the book I lay out a bunch of different options for students beyond thinking about that 4-year degree. I mean, I think this college for everyone movement, which has pushed, students to college
Right.
somewhat, in some cases, somewhat prematurely, puts a lot of students in debt and they end up dropping out. And so that really worries me. And I think, again, the book lays out other things that students could do. You need an education after high school, and I think we need to kind of almost reframe education after high school. But you could get an apprenticeship. You could go to a community college and test out options there.
Right.
So I think that parents and students need to reframe or rethink what they mean and what they want from education after high school.
Definitely. Now, talking about, saying reframing or rethinking, you have mentioned, the idea of the 4-year college concept that we have here. What do you think might be more beneficial instead of that 4-year idea, or what are some other countries doing that are different?
So I talk about in the book the idea of the apprenticeship, which used to be a big deal in the U.S. It's not anymore. It's a big deal in much of Europe, particularly Germany and Switzerland. And there's a number of programs that I profile in the book, including one in North Carolina. The problem is that most students are still pushed to go to a 4-year college. And so what we need to do is kind of change the cultural arguments around education after high school and encourage more students to do that. And so I think what it will take is a number of high-profile options that to parents and students look just as good as going to a 4-year college. And what do I mean by that? So, for example, AmeriCorps is seen as a great thing to do after high school if you're not ready to go to college. It's a national service program, but there are more than twice as many people who apply for that program as there are spots. So I think that if we are able to create, true national service options, have options to go to community colleges, apprenticeships, and think highly of them, I think that for a group of students who college is not right for, I think that they're going to have more high quality options to do after high school.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit then for a minute about college UnBound. There are plenty, as you're saying, doing something after apprenticeship or whatnot. What else do you lay out in College UnBound that helps those who just don't believe that they are meant to go to these 4-year colleges?
Right. So it's actually, I think you're talking about There Is Life After College, which is the new book. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, College UnBound is my previous book. So
right.
Is the older book. Sorry.
Yeah.
And I actually, there's some overlap between the books, and I talk a lot about these pathways to college. So, for example, I talk a lot about these transition years that are growing in popularity. I talked about them earlier as gap years. Most people think of gap years as something you backpack through Europe.
Right.
But in the book, I profile these efforts, one up in Baltimore. I live in Washington, D.C., so not far from me in Baltimore. That is what's called a gap year for all. So it's less expensive. It's a couple of $1,000s. Students can do it using federal financial aid. And what it allows them to do is it gives them a work experience. It gives them an internship. It gives them a mentorship to help them explore careers. And it gives them academic help, particularly in courses where they might be having difficulties. What ends up happening is a number of kids go to college every year and they have to take what are known as remedial courses, which are essentially do-over courses from high school. They don't count for credit. They're expensive. And many students, if you don't pass them, you never get to college. You never actually take college courses anyway. So this effort really moves those out of the college environment into this transition year. And also gives students really what mostly they need are mentorships. Most kids at 18, I'm 40, I don't even know what I want to do necessarily, but most kids at 18 have no idea what they want to do. And so they end up going to college as kind of a convenient place to go next. And we don't give them a lot of career exploration options. And so the nice thing I like about this program, and there's a bunch of them now across the country, is that and this is called Bridge EDU up in Baltimore, it gives them options to look for careers earlier in life and gives them a chance to explore.
Okay. I thought we could talk maybe a little bit about your other book, MOOC U, which is Massive Open Online Courses, is what that stands for. You said that it's been called the higher education savior. What is this primarily, and what do you write about in the book?
So MOOC U, MOOC stands for Massively Open Online Courses. And these kind of came on the scene about 5-6 years ago, offered by some of the most prestigious universities in the country, so Stanford, Harvard, Yale. and
Okay.
others. And the idea was they're going to offer their content for free online to anybody who signed up. And so Stanford did this. The first course they put up, 175,000 people from around the world signed up.
Oh my goodness.
Most of these courses have a lot of people sign up. Only about 10% of them complete the courses.
Oh
And so
wow.
the book, MOOC U, and so a lot of people call them failures as a result, right? They said, well, people are signing up for these courses, they're not finishing them, they must be failures. Well, one of the things that I found when I was reporting MOOC U, which follows students in one course at the University of Virginia, is that most students actually don't sign up for these courses with a idea of completing them because they're free. The risk is low, but mostly what they're signing up for is they're signing up for the content. It's almost like looking at YouTube and figuring out, okay, I need to learn about X. I followed a course for the book on entrepreneurship. And instead of like searching YouTube for videos or searching for books on Amazon for entrepreneurship, what the course does is essentially curate that all together. And most students then go to that and they want to pick one course or I'm sorry, one lecture, or they want to read one book. So they have no intention of ever actually taking the course, but what they want are pieces of content that are essentially validated for them that they can take. And that was the most interesting finding in that book, is that we tend to think, well, if students don't complete a course, it must not have been useful to them.
Right.
But most of the students I interviewed for the book actually found the courses incredibly useful, because somebody basically did the work that they would have to do on their own to try to figure out, okay, I need content on this subject. Where do I find it? It's almost like if you're trying to cook something, a new recipe, or you're trying to fix something in your house, and you go to YouTube and there's a million videos on how to fix a leaky sink, and you're trying to find the best one. It's like a needle in a haystack. Well, these courses essentially do that for you.
Okay. Very interesting. So, what advice would you have for the high school senior or parent of the senior that's getting ready to head into college, but they're looking at some major debt along the way? Do you have anything that you would say right off the bat? Here's what you should know. Here's what maybe you can do.
Well, I think that debt has to be one of several measures that you consider when you're looking at colleges.
Okay.
So, for example, when you look at colleges, you should look at their debt, the debt you're going to have to take on. And by the way, you should multiply that by 4 years,
Yeah.
because you're going to be there for 4 years. I think most people look at debt and they're like, oh, I'm going to take on a $10,000 loan. And the fact of the matter is, you're going to take that $10,000 loan probably every year, and most likely it's going to get much higher.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, tuition's going to go up naturally, but also freshmen tend to get more aid than an upperclassmen do.
Mm.
So the fact of the matter is that some of your aid might disappear after your first year, and you're going to end up having to pay more for it anyway. So that's number one. You should look at graduation rates are important to look at. So one college might be more expensive than another one you're looking at, but it might take you 2 or 3 more years to graduate based on the graduation rate. And you want to look at graduation rates, and colleges have this, but they don't advertise them. You want to look at graduation rates by your major or by your school, and by your gender, because graduation rates differ depending on who you are and what you're doing. And so again, if the school is cheap, but it's going to take you 6 years to graduate, it actually might be a better idea to go to that school where you're going to actually have a better chance of graduating in 4 years. So those are 2 key things to look at. And the third thing is post-graduation in terms of placement. Now, every college will tell you 90+% of their graduates get jobs 6 months after graduation.
Right.
In fact, when I was researching for this book, I couldn't find a college that had an under 90% placement rate. Now, what they won't tell you is that about maybe a third of students or a third of recent graduates actually filled out those surveys. So very few people are filling out those surveys. Most of the people filling out the survey have a job, because they probably wouldn't fill out the survey if they didn't have a
Right.
job. And rarely do their surveys tell you if those people have a job related to their major, if they're full-time work, or their work that you're even passionate about, right? All it says is they have a job. It's a check mark.
Right.
I think parents need much more detailed information when they're looking at colleges.
Absolutely. And what about, right, piggybacking on that, what about advice for those students who are just graduating, or say looking to graduate even in the next couple months? Any advice for them looking for that first job, or, what can you say to that?
Well, so the big thing, and this is hard, and trust me, I'm Gen X. I would not want to be a millennial right now looking for a job. So, and so I give this advice with and I say it with that. I give that preface before I
Hmm.
give this advice. But I say this in the book: don't take just any job after graduation. Be very careful, because I met a number of people in reporting this book, and we see this even from the survey that I took, who took a job because they needed one, again, largely because of debt. And they said, oh, I'll be here 6 months or a year,
Right.
right? Well, now I'm interviewing these students and they're 25 and they're still in that job. And now they're competing with students who are now just a year out of college or just graduated or 2 years out of college. So they're now, the competition has just heightened
Right.
since they graduated. Their skills have not necessarily improved. They haven't done much to improve their skills, and they're literally wandering through their mid 20s. So that first job after graduation is critically important. You want to make sure that you're going to learn something on it, that you're going to have good peers and good coworkers, that there's room to not only learn but to potentially uh, uh, get better jobs through that, not only within the company but outside the company. There's
Right.
nothing wrong. I think people think, well, people who job hop are looked down upon. There's nothing wrong with job hopping through your 20s. It's a place where you kind of figure out where you can find an occupation,
Yeah.
what kind of job you can find, and eventually you're going to get paid more the more you job hop.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, two things to what you said. The first, speaking of job hopping, that is I think that is still something that is somewhat frowned upon. I've heard, oh, employers aren't going to like it. They're not going to like if you're only there for 6 months. Is that a myth? Has that changed over the years? What's happening with that?
So if there's employers on this, they're not going to like this. Well, it's not a myth. I think employers do get upset, but I think that students, if you look at the statistics, you're going to do much better in your career and in your earning power over time, the more jobs you move through your 20s. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if you have a great job in your 20s, you should leave, right?
Right.
But the more you move, the better off you're going to be at finding the right occupation. Occupations and entire careers, come and go now at an alarming pace. So you want to really find something that you're comfortable with, you're passionate about in your 20s, and the only way you figure that out is by occupation shopping or job
Mhm.
shopping. Right? You
Right.
move around a little bit and figure out what you want to do and the people you want to work with. So it's I would say it's a myth that it's a bad idea. Again, employers are going to want to encourage you to stay. I don't think there's anything wrong with in your 20s having a couple of jobs, because I think over the long run that's going to help.
Right.
And of
Yeah.
course, that's coming from somebody, by the way, who had mostly one job in his 20s. But I found a place not only where I liked it and I was a reporter and I eventually became an editor, but every couple of years at my job in my 20s, I moved into a different role, an
Okay.
increasingly more progressive
Right.
role in
Right.
terms of management. So it was good for me in that way.
Absolutely. And I think too, I was also kind of alluding to maybe the employer looking for that new employee, looking at that resume saying, oh, you've been here, you were only here for 6 months, you were only here for 8. Is that, but this other person is applying for the job and they've been at their job for 5 years. So we want that person, they seem more stable. Is that still kind of how it's looked at? I think that was part of of where I was going with that.
Oh, some employers could do that. I talked earlier about people analytics and this idea
Right.
of companies trying to figure out what makes employees succeed. The more they base it on data and what I should hire this person based on the data, I think the better off they're going to be. And
Mhm.
so, yes, there's a lot of gut instinct in hiring. And there might be some employer you interview with who doesn't like people who move jobs.
Mhm.
Then that's the chance you take. I
Right.
think 9 times out of 10, you're going to be better off in the long
Absolutely. Okay. I'd love to get to some viewer questions before we wrap up here. I think, let's see, Callie is asking, why do you think colleges are building dorms that are maybe fancier or resort-like? Is it kind of adding to the craziness, or maybe are they trying to attract? Just piggybacking on that question.
Yeah, so there is this amenities arms race going on right now in higher
Right.
education. It has been going on. I think it's starting to slow down a little bit, but the amenities arms race is about building the best dorms, the
Right.
best recreation centers with the climbing walls, the great dining halls with sushi, and
Yeah.
every imaginable food you want. And largely that's because there's a lot of competition for students because the number of high school graduates has been dropping. And so it's a lot easier to show off a fancy dorm than it is to show a classroom that is working, right? Or a class that is great, right? It's something that shiny new object that tends to attract um, parents and students. I wouldn't be too enamored with them.
Mhm.
Again, an institution that spends too much money on these amenities may not be spending money in the right places.
Exactly.
So I think it's something you want to be careful of.
Okay. Um, Jocelyn is asking, do you think that campuses have improved their facilities over the years? What happens if a school doesn't have funds to add these luxuries? I think maybe a little similar to what we were just talking about.
Yeah, again, it's becoming much more difficult for schools to afford all these amenities. And again, I think that if you don't pick a school based on the amenities, largely, by the way, those things cost a lot of money.
Hmm.
A place like, so for example, Georgia State has a football team now. The student fees for athletics are in some cases just as high as the fees for tuition, right? So what ends up happening is that at the end of the day, students are going to have to pay for this. And so you want to be very careful not to go to a place that focuses too much on their facilities and not enough on their
Okay. And Brian is asking, what do you think higher education is going to look like 10 years
academics.
from now?
I wish I knew the future.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's going to be much more individualized pathways. I talk a lot about this in the new book. I think that there's going to be a combination where students are able to do much more online. That doesn't mean they'll go to school online. I don't think most 18-year-olds want to go online, but I think that there's going to be many more pathways. So there'll be some online, some face-to-face. I think there's going to be many more co-op opportunities, meaning you're going to have work experiences built into the college experience. You're going to have what they call low residency options. So you could go to campus just for a couple of weeks
Mm.
and then go off and do work or a research project or whatever. So in other words, right now we have kind of a one size fits all system. You go to almost any college, it feels kind of the same. And I think we're going to see many more individualized pathways in the future.
Interesting. This this kind of goes along with something that we were talking about earlier. Dustin is asking, have you seen a shift in goals for kids coming out of high school now versus 10 years ago? You even just mentioned there's less kids coming out of high school graduating. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, the big thing is that every year UCLA takes a survey of new college freshmen. And the big change today of those freshmen compared to 10 years ago is that the number one reason for going to college is to get a better job
Right.
or to get a job. 10 years ago and previous to that, so this was a switch that happened about 10 years ago, the number one reason for going to college was to gain an education, a broad education. So we now see college much more, or at least the kids coming out of high school and going to college, see college much more as a means to an end of getting that job than students 10 years ago did.
Okay, very interesting. Um, Unfortunately, we're out of time and we're at the end of our live chat, but this was fascinating, very interesting, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book. And if anyone wants to know more, read more, go grab There Is Life After College. Jeff, thank you again so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.